Great. So good morning. So welcome to the April 1st Friday webinar. Our topic this Friday is Let Us Help You, a summary of international student research and its application to residential context, with Mariam from the University of Washington. And so we are going to get started here. I'm going to pass it over to Mariam and Suann. Welcome.
Good morning, everybody. If you can't hear us, just let us know. Hopefully you got the handout that Kate sent out yesterday, so it might be helpful if you have the chance to either print it out or have it up next to you so you can kind of think about some of the questions that in a maybe more person-to-person format or more in-person presentation would be discussion questions, but because of the webinar format, they're going to be kind of reflection questions as we go along, and then at the end, we're going to open it up for discussion or sharing of ideas or telling us about things that have worked well at your institution. So we're excited to have that time to share at the end. So a little bit of information about why we're here and talking about this subject. My name is Mariam Mead Yaqub. I am a resident director at the University of Washington, but I had kind of a different path to res life than a lot of my colleagues. My master's degree is in international education, and I had two previous positions in which I worked almost exclusively with international students, and the one that I came to directly from UW from was as an international student program coordinator. So I really have a passion for working with international students, and that's kind of my academic background.
And then, hello everyone, my name is Huang, and I am a resident director also at the University of Washington right now. This is my fourth year being an RD. And I worked in two different communities, and just during my time at the UW, the international student enrollment has increased a ton. And there's just been some interesting pushback sort of from students on campus and even just, I think, alumni about sort of how many international students we have here and whether that's having a positive or negative impact. I currently work in the Mercer Apartments, which is a large complex, and we have about 40% of our community is international students in a range of undergrads and grads. So that's about 500 students, and so I work with a lot of international students very closely on a daily basis.
Before we get started talking about the research, we're going to provide a little bit of context in terms of what's happening nationally in the United States and Canada so that we can all kind of situate our own experiences on our campuses with what's happening in the larger picture. So first we'll start with the United States. As you can see from the ever-increasing circles, international student enrollment has basically just been increasing over the last half century, and it's projected to continue increasing. Overall in the United States, it grew by 8%, but definitely at some institutions that number was much, much higher. And in the United States, total 4% of the U.S. higher education population are international students, but again, depending on the institution, that could be significantly higher or lower. And this, the place where it says primary source of funding is something that I'd like to draw your attention to, because definitely with 65% of international students funded by personal and family funds, that is the majority of students are coming and they're funding their own education. And in order to get most kinds of student visas, international students have to show the government that they have the ability to fund their education before they can even get approved for that visa. And so there's often a belief that many international students come from privileged backgrounds. Their families have a lot of money to be able to afford to send them to study and to pay all this money. And often it's at private universities, it's just tuition. At public universities, it would be the out-of-state tuition, plus often there's an international student fee or international student charges. And while that definitely may be the case for some students, several research studies have found that actually for a lot of students, that money is not just coming from their parents, but it's coming from many, many members of the family spread over for several generations. And so when we're thinking about some of the pressure that our students face, and we're going to talk about perfectionism in a little bit, it's important, I think, to keep in mind that for some of the students that we're working with, they might have the entire life savings of maybe 15 different members of their family invested in their ability to come to the United States and pay that tuition and study. And so when we're thinking about the pressure that must feel for somebody who's in their, possibly late teens, I think that's something to keep in mind. And then as we can see, where the majority of international students come to the United States from, a lot of these nations are Pacific Rim nations. And since we in our Northwest Akuho region are also very much situated on the Pacific Rim, this is something that we see in our region. And then in Canada, We're also seeing similar increases. In 2014, the Canadian government explicitly announced plans to double its international enrollment, so that's a little bit different in the United States, where it's certainly something that's happening, but it hasn't been expressed as much as a goal at the national level. So the goal is to double it by 2022, and the government has dedicated $18 million from the federal budget to market it. So the idea of sending the message out into the world that Canada is a world-class education destination. And the reason for this $18 million investment is that the government believes that recruiting these international students would generate 86,000 new jobs and add an additional $10 billion to the economy. And specifically looking at our region, more than a quarter of all international students in all of Canada are in British Columbia.
So we wanted to provide some kind of general information about supporting international students, depending on kind of what your experiences have been. So some of the key differences that we found for international students are things related to classroom culture. So understanding student and faculty roles and how they interact and how we might interact with faculty and how students might interact with faculty in the U.S. or in Canada versus kind of their home country, what classroom participation looks like. We're not, while we do have lots of large lectures, we're not purely lecture. We want people to participate. And then also what academic integrity looks like and how it could be maybe different in different countries. Also, for a lot of our international students, there is a newfound freedom, and so there might be a freedom to have a choice in your academics. And there is also, of course, a pressure to socialize and meet new people from the home country, or from the host country, and so that could be a very different experience than our students have had before. There's obviously also stiff competition for admission. International students still need to get into the institution, and again, when you're applying to a completely different system where you might not understand it, it can be extra challenging. And then, of course, there's a pressure to do well. Some of the transitional issues that our international students face are unpredictability of daily life, and so, being in a new country, you have to think about things like, how am I going to get food? Where are the places that I can get food? All of those different things that we probably take for granted you can't take for granted as an international student. Also, again, different expectations about how we interact with your peers or authority figures or faculty. All of that can be a little bit different. Different value systems, difficulty in communicating, of course, especially if it's a different language, if it's your second language, difficulty making friends with people from the country that you're studying in, and then kind of this, quote, culture shock. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how it's a slightly outdated term, but.
So in terms of why are we talking about this, understanding how to better serve international students is essential for supporting our current students, of course, which is important for retention. And, of course, we want to make sure that all of the students that we have are doing well and thriving, and so giving them the support that they need. It's also important for maintaining recruitment and occupancy in the future, and we're going to circle around to that at the end of the presentation. But thinking about this retention idea for a moment, there's a study that came out last year that tested lots and lots and lots of different factors that might impact retention.
It seems like we're having a problem seeing the screen right now, and so give us 1 second and we will try to figure this out. Sorry about this. Okay, we are back in business. Sorry about that.
Oh, we're not in full screen. Okay, there we go. Technical difficulties. Okay, so they tested lots and lots of factors that might impact retention, kind of everything you can think of that, might have an impact on whether students continue or not. And actually only 3 were found to have significant effect, and this was specifically for international students. One of them was GPA average in spring of freshman year, which makes sense, especially considering all those transitional issues that Sue Ann was talking about, that it might take a semester to kind of get on your feet, so really looking at spring as that crucial term that's kind of setting the tone for the rest of their time. Taking a heavier course load, which is kind of interesting because you might think, don't take too many classes, just get adjusted. But the thought behind this is that for international students, really focusing on academics is really important, even more so than for domestic students adjusting to the college environment, again, because of all the transitional issues, the fact that doing higher education in a language that is not your first language is tremendously challenging. And so a heavier course load kind of forces students students to focus on their classes. And then on-campus employment, which is also important to note that besides all of the developmental and social factors that working on campus gives, also because of their visas, most international students cannot work off of campus, and so this is their main opportunity to earn some money. Okay, so looking at international student transitions, until recently there hasn't been a lot of research, and even now you might notice names repeating a little bit when we're looking at our references sheet or as we go through the presentation. A lot of the scholarship in this idea of culture shock is rooted in research from the 1950s and 60s that was actually developed to talk about anthropologists from Western institutions who were going and studying in the field. And so this idea that you can see it on the screen that we're starting at this high honeymoon period, everything's going well, and then you kind of plummet down and all the transitional issues and it's really difficult, and then you start to learn skills to be successful in this new environment, and then you climb out. And then it was adapted into a W curve. Maybe you have a similar adjustment when you go back to your home culture. But we're finding out more and more that this is not really relevant to a lot of students' experiences, although it is still used a lot, and that's why we're talking about it. This graph that I have here is actually taken from another Pac-12 institution that is not part of Northwest Tacujo, but from their website, and so it's still commonly used, but we're finding out that it's not necessarily relevant to a lot of students' experience. And so now there's more of a focus on this idea of acculturative stress, which is a psychological impact of all the different things that come into play when you're adapting to a new cultural environment. And so the two scholars that you see on the screen, Hoda and Ting Toomey, decided instead of trying to force our students to fit into this model that we've come up with based on theory, why don't we ask them what their experience was like? And so they interviewed lots and lots of students about their experience, and they gave them a blank graph. And so you can see the feeling is low, medium, high, so kind of how are you feeling at any given time. And then on the bottom you can see time, so as their time in the United States progressed. With starting at like their first day, their first experience in the United States. And you can see that these three graphs are the most common responses they got. Obviously, they were little tiny differences between people, but if you kind of overall look at the shape, these were the most common by far. And we can see that all of our students said that in the beginning they were actually struggling, like everybody started out really low. And so since we tend to focus on those first couple weeks anyway as a really important transition time, it's important to know that for a lot of our international students, that's a really difficult time.
So obviously in residential life, we think a lot about sense of belonging. So what is interesting to note is that, and probably not surprising, that our international students tended to rate their sense of community and sense of belonging significantly lower than their U.S. peers, especially when considering kind of whether they felt to be part of a close and supportive community. So again, I think because of all the acculturative stress that we've been talking about, this is not surprising, but it is something that we do need to be aware of. Students from China and South Korea actually indicated that they felt threatened around people with different backgrounds from their own. So I think that, regardless of them being in the U.S. or not, or in Canada or not, that was something that they sometimes feel, and so that's, I'm sure, enhanced when they're in a different country and surrounded by people who are maybe not like them. What's also interesting is that in general, U.S. students felt lower levels of threat in the U.S., which makes sense, but actually Canadian students, while in the U.S., felt even less threatened in general. So that's just kind of a fun fact. Many students from China and Saudi Arabia and South Korea indicated feeling a lack of connection in general while studying abroad or while being kind of an international student. And then what is good to note is that being involved in leadership programs that encourage teams of students with different cultural backgrounds had a positive effect on international students' sense of community. And what is even greater, since what we do in student affairs and in housing, students who are able to express they have a stronger sense of belonging also then experience greater academic success. So what we do in the residence halls by building community and getting students to feel a sense of belonging impacts their academic success. So yay for us. In addition, participation in co-curricular activities along with, of course, their coursework increased the sense of belonging and indirectly had a positive effect on academic success. So we're doing good things to make sure that our international students are being successful academically.
And so specifically looking at how to build that sense of community, diversity-related co-curricular activities were found to be a significant predictor of social interaction between domestic and international students, which was in turn found to facilitate their social networking and give them opportunities to practice language in a low-risk context. And obviously in diversity-related activities, they're head-on dealing with these issues of, cross-cultural communication and intercultural dialogue. But interestingly, it was also found that even non-diversity related activities had similar effects, which is kind of surprising because they're not explicitly dealing with cultural issues. But researchers think that because they're working together on a mutual goal, so for example, they're planning a program for their residential community or advocating for an issue, it enables students to kind of come up from the side to cross-cultural issues. So by the nature that they're working in these mixed groups, they still have to deal with these cross-cultural issues, but they do it from maybe a less scary way because they're kind of coming up to it from the side while they have a different goal for their group. However, there are 4 factors that need to be present in order for this to happen. And the first one is the equal status of groups, so that, of course, if one group is explicitly privileged above another, then that's going to break down this equality. The common goal, so the idea that everybody is working towards something together. The intergroup cooperation, so when we're thinking of, programming groups or how we want to organize our leadership, we can think of making sure that students are intentionally placed with other students who have different backgrounds so that they have a chance to collaborate. And then support from those in the position of authority. So whether we're talking about advisors or administrators, communicating that this is a goal that we have and this is something that we support. And then international students who did participate in these collaborative and team-oriented leadership programs, so whether they were diversity-focused or not, reported a more positive perception of the climate for diversity across the whole campus. So they might just be doing one specific thing, say, in hall council, but when you ask them, how does your institution handle diversity, they feel more positively about it. And then greater levels of personal and social development. And these connections are really important. International students express that they often prefer friendships with people from the host country, and they desire more contact with them. And international students who do have more contact report higher levels of satisfaction with their study abroad experience overall. They have less social difficulties. They have to improve communication skills in the new language because, again, they're having a chance to practice, and it's in kind of a low-risk environment. And they report less homesickness and loneliness. So really positive things. And one group of researchers goes so far as to say, not this is a great fluffy thing to have, but they say it's actually integral to adjustment process. So really, adjustment process can't happen without these friendships. Unfortunately, we know that it's not so easy. So international students often express that they feel that domestic students don't want to be friends. As you can see, multiple studies use the word disappointed, discouraged. They had expectations of local friendships. They weren't met. They made overtures of friendship, and then those didn't develop into what they felt were true friendships. And then some other separate studies have found that 4 out of 5 domestic students report that they don't interact with international students in any meaningful way. So while this certainly may be different on some campuses, we can understand why international students overall are reporting that they aren't feeling very welcomed and they're not developing friendships when domestic students are saying that they don't really engage with them. But it's not all negative news. Domestic students who exhibit the trait of open-mindedness is correlated with having friends who are international students, especially those close friendships that international students are telling us they want, and spending more time with those friends. And best of all, open-mindedness is not something that you're born, either you're open-minded or you're closed-minded, and that's how it's going to be forever. But it's a kind of an attitude that can be cultivated with education and experiences. And so since we work so much on development in the housing field, we can work on helping our domestic students develop this trait of open-mindedness.
So social media is something that I think we all use in our work, and we're all trying to think about different ways that we can use it. And I think with any students who are transitioning to college, we've noticed that if they are thinking a lot about their high school friends and trying to stay super connected to their high school friends, they're maybe not transitioning that well into their new college environment. This is definitely the case with international students as well. And so what is interesting is that international students who are using more U.S.-based social media sites, so like Facebook, instead of just their home country sites or no social media at all, were less likely to experience mental health concerns. So if they were taking the time to be on Facebook and try to interact with other students from their host country, they were more likely to adjust a little bit. What's interesting is that Facebook provides a low-risk way to connect with American friends without being maybe as nervous about speaking kind of face-to-face or having people, kind of react in a in-person context, and also provides a way for students to learn about the U.S. culture. So Facebook has some perks.
So specifically focusing on the mental health aspect, there was a large study that focused on East Asian international students, and that's because they are the largest group of international students. And they found that they were at increased risk of depression compared to domestic students at similar institutions. The authors think that this is because of the effects of acculturative stress, like Sue Ann mentioned, and we keep talking about language barriers, the adjustment, the lack of friendship, especially if you came expecting to make friendships and you're trying to make friendships and you're not feeling like they're reciprocated. That's a really difficult situation. And then, of course, the unfamiliarity, just kind of trying to figure out how daily life works and how to navigate. They also found one other factor that was really important, and that's what they call maladaptive perfectionism. So this is kind of the harmful kind of perfectionism, the kind that we would be worried if we saw it in any of our students. So, really intense anxiety, having expectations that there's no way that they can meet, really kind of berating themselves when they're not doing well. And I think it's important here to also think about maybe what some of their family expectations might be and why you would place that pressure on yourself if, if you felt like your whole family was investing in you. And so the researchers encourage staff to be attentive to, of course, their acculturation challenges, but also really to pay attention to that perfectionism piece. And so when we're working with students of concern, we can start thinking about the perfectionism piece and maybe asking some more questions about academics to see if they might be at greater risk of depression because of this. Another study did not look at the perfectionism piece, but they looked at acculturative stress and also language ability. And they found, unsurprisingly, that lower English language proficiency also contributed to depression, and they think that's because of the difficulties of communication. And also, if you have lower proficiency, you're less likely to maybe seek help from an English-speaking counselor. Which brings us to our next slide. Unfortunately, international students are found to also have lower utilization rates of counseling services than domestic students. And some of the barriers can be the level of acculturation. If you just feel kind of overwhelmed in a very new environment, then seeking out help is probably just an additional step that's kind of overwhelming. English proficiency, like I mentioned, the idea that there's a stigma attached to seeking help, and this is certainly something we see with our domestic students as well, but depending on the family and cultural background, for some international students it may be increased. The belief that counseling is only for people with serious mental illness, and so being suicidal was something that several students mentioned, and this was found across several studies. As you can see in the citation, there are multiple studies, so it wasn't just something that came up in one group of students. It came up over and over and across several years. And then the concern that counselors would not be culturally sensitive or understanding, that they might be forcing kind of beliefs that weren't appropriate to them, or telling them, don't listen to what your family says, or something like that really just wasn't an option for them. And so ways to encourage students to seek help, keeping in mind these barriers, are framing counseling as a proactive way of promoting kind of success in general in academics, your career. Also reframing it as helpful for those acculturation and adjustment pieces, so making friends, just the fact that a new environment can be really stressful. And so I included the wellness wheel that I know a lot of institutions use their version of this, because this kind of idea of overall wellness and counseling is a piece in it rather than it's only for people with serious mental illness. Emphasizing the confidentiality can be really helpful, especially with the stigma piece. And then, of course, a lot of institutions have resources. They have counselors who maybe speak Mandarin or Korean, or they've had special training in cross-cultural issues. And so being familiar with what those options are and then communicating them to students can also help them.
This is also good news for us, but we found through our research that living on campus is a great thing. So there are clearly lots of factors that can cause stress for international students. And some of the most acute acculturative stressors were things that were related to logistics. So things like finding a place to live, figuring out how to get to and from campus. So very logistical pieces that are very practical and needed, but if you're living on campus, you actually don't need to worry about. And so for international students, living on campus is a great way to not have to worry about those things in the beginning, at least, so that they can be focusing on their academics and focusing on finding connections and that kind of a thing. So by making these steps easier for international students, campus housing can provide a definite benefit. And so I think it's great to know that we can speak very specifically about how residential life and housing operations are definitely a positive thing for our international students.
So kind of bringing this back to the why does this matter question. Well, first of all, there was a recent study last year of staff in residence life, student counseling centers, career services, so student affairs staff who were working a lot with students. And they reported that they work closely with a lot of international students, but half of them said they felt unprepared to work with international students. 90% said they wanted more training, and 64% said their offices were not doing anything in particular. So this is obviously an area of need across the nation. And this was in the United States, but I would assume in Canada with the similar increase that it's a similar situation. So definitely an area where increased attention and training is needed. Obviously, there has been a huge increase in numbers of international students, and this is set to continue. And of course, we want to serve all of our students effectively. That is at the basis of all of our missions, and so we want to make sure that we're supporting the students we have. In addition, it's really important when thinking about occupancy, and our director likes to say that occupancy is everybody's business. And this is really true in lots of ways, but you can especially see it with international students because a lot of incoming students get a very significant amount of information from co-nationals who are already at that institution. So hopefully they're also looking at the official websites and kind of where we're giving the institution's version of information, but they also really go to other people from their country who they might not know previously, but they're able, using the internet and stuff, to connect and ask them, what is life at your institution like? What is it like to live on campus? What is your experience like? And I included the picture that's on the slide because one of the students on the slide this is his second year living with us. And last year, he really had a difficult transition. There was a lot of frustration. There were a lot of those maybe expectations that he came, this is what the university is going to do for me, and this is how staff should interact with me. And some of them just weren't feasible, and they weren't happening, and he was really frustrated. And then he actually had a friend from his home country who left in the middle of the year kind of unexpectedly, and that was really hard. And it was just kind of a difficult year. But he got involved in student leadership, and I met with him a lot, and we talked about expectations, and he got involved in another organization on campus. And then he went home for the summer. And then we started having all these applications to our student leadership program, and we were kind of confused because we hadn't actually advertised it yet. And so we were like, how are these students finding out? Like, what's happening? And then they came, and then, students moved in the fall, and we found out that over the summer he had been hosting multiple meetups in India and telling everybody how great UW was and that they should come to UW and they should live on campus and they should live in our specific community and they should get involved in house council. And several of these students actually did. So we had a posse of maybe 5 people that he single-handedly recruited, and they're still involved in house council even now in spring quarter. So a small example, but if you imagine that kind of playing out all over the world, you can see what a powerful effect it can be.
So there's lots of research that suggested that some of the different opportunities that we had were kind of cross-departmental and campus-wide. So there's lots of research that suggests that dialogue that includes multiple people across the campus would be really helpful to really supporting our international students. So getting dialogue between administrators, faculty, international educators, and student affairs professionals so that they could all talk about what they're noticing the international student needs to be, how they are kind of addressing those needs, and then new ways to address anything that might be unmet. One example that we have at UW is the International Student Success Committee, and so this is a committee that I think formed maybe 2 years ago or so, but is still fairly new, and is a committee that I got to serve on in an interim role over kind of last spring and in the summer for a little bit. And so this committee is made up of lots of different professionals across campus. So there is residential life representation, there is someone from the counseling center, someone from career services, people from our academic kind of student support services, someone from our undergraduate academic advising office, someone from our two people actually, I think, from our international student services office, one who works more with some of the visa pieces, one who works more with study abroad and exchange students. There is someone from our community standards and conduct office. There's someone who works specifically with international student admissions, and there are probably 1 or 2 others that I can't think of right now. So it's a committee made up of a lot of different people. They meet, I believe, biweekly still, to kind of talk about what are the things that they're noticing. Are there trends that some offices are coming across that we should talk about with all of the different people so that they can bring it back to their individual committees or departments. And so they're able to then really collaborate and think about what are the needs of our international students and what is relevant in different ways. Oh, I forgot, we have an office called FIUS, which is our Foundation for Intercultural Understanding through Students. And they're essentially they were the ones who facilitate our international student orientation and plan a bunch of programs for our international students, and so they're obviously represented as well. And so this committee is able to, I think, kind of really do that kind of department-wide sharing of knowledge and to really address our international students. And so I think this is a good idea for different campuses, at your campuses, to see if there are ways that you all can kind of form some of those collaborative opportunities to really share what is going on with your international students.
And the goal suggested by some of the researchers that we looked at was to move away from this idea, the need for help paradigm. So like, oh, international students, it's so hard for them, we need to help them, and focus on all of the amazing skills that they're already using to be successful and to get through this transition, and to kind of focus on developing those skills into resiliency, and so kind of moving away from the we need to help them idea. So something that just kind of keep in mind through the rest of the slides when we start to talk about things we can do. So looking across all of housing and kind of the big picture, one of the suggestions is to intentionally house international students with local students because it increases opportunity for communications. It provides what's called a weak tie relationship, so maybe not a really deep friendship, but there is at least a real in-person connection happening. And this idea that we see, it's actually from social psychology, and it holds across a lot of groups, that for people in which they might hold stereotypes about a different group, that when there's friendly contact and you actually start to base your observations on real interactions instead of what you had in your mind already, then that can actually break down stereotypes. Of course, we know that doesn't always happen perfectly, that in some cases roommates don't even really communicate at all, but in some cases it can kind of set the scene for that to happen. One nice example of that from an institution that is not in our region but doing something really interesting is at Northern Arizona University. They recently opened International House, and they do intentional roommate pairings with international students on the basis of language. So 90% of the domestic students in the house are fluent or studying another language, and then they pair them with international students for whom that's their native language. And so it's kind of creating built-in language conversation partners into the roommate relationship. Okay, well, that's all the information that we have, but now it's time to hear from all of you. We have lots of discussion questions, but we would love to hear kind of anything that you're thinking right now, questions that you have, or what you're doing at your institution.
Yeah, so just type into the chat box, and we'll read out some questions for Sue and Miriam. That was an incredible presentation. An incredible amount of work in terms of the information gathering that you did, and some really surprising things that I found in terms of how we are approaching the students in terms of less of a need to help and more of the support and the resiliency, I think, is really, really important. So this presentation was one of the best of Northwest Akuho, so kudos. And I know that you've presented this a couple of times. What have been some great questions that you might have received in the past, or great comments from folks, or kind of aha moments?
We actually presented it to some of our colleagues yesterday, and somebody asked a question about whether we had seen in the research whether people were even researching it, and if so, what the kind of outcome was about the difference in support between having support kind of concentrated within an international students office, or in the example of University of Washington, what we call FIUS, or whether it was more helpful to have it kind of spread across the whole university, but then there's maybe less expertise. And I thought that was a wonderful question. It didn't come up explicitly in really any of the information we saw. So if anybody out there has seen anything like that, we would love to see it. But kind of reading between the lines from what we saw in the research, we found that we thought it was probably a combination, because certainly international students have very specific needs, especially in terms of compliance with, the Department of Homeland Security and visa and all that, and that requires very specific information and specific governmental roles, actually, that people on campus need to have. But then they certainly cannot be the only ones supporting, and especially when you think about numbers, as international student populations have increased and increased and increased. If there's maybe a couple people working in an international student office, that, of course, is not enough, by any means to support thousands and thousands of international students on some campuses. So the idea that this really is kind of everyone's business and thinking what we all can do to support students. Did you have any? We should also put out some of the questions.
Great. Waiting for questions, but Mariam and Sue-Ann are happy to keep reading through. So we're going to cut to some of the discussion questions. So hopefully everyone I was able to send out these discussion questions. We do have a comment here. Outstanding work, very informative, and thank you for including stats on Canada. I really appreciate that since I did my undergrad at UBC, and I know we have some Mount Royal folks here today, so thanks for doing that. And they're asking, your International Student Success Committee, was it chaired or created through the Residence Life Office or the International Office? And Michelle has joined us.
Speaking of international students, I apologize. I was coming from an international student admitted student session. And Sue-Ann stepped into the ISSC for me on our campus this summer, and we actually grew organically. So when our campus instituted an international student fee, a few different positions across campus were created in ISS, our International Student Services, so the folks with that visa expertise that Mariam was alluding to, with SciUS and with undergraduate advising. And they were brand new to the university. They saw a need to start to learn more about what we were doing, and as the three of them got together, they then started to reach out to some specific folks. So it really happened organically. It was not a charge. And we have kind of rotated who the chair is. I think one of the pieces, as you think about this for your own institution, one of the pieces that we continually grapple with is what is the right size for a group like that? So you want to have a lot of voices at the table, but as we all know, if you have too many folks trying to be very task-oriented, it can be very difficult. And so trying to figure out what's the right size for a work group on your campus, and does it make sense for perhaps other folks to get pulled in on a project basis rather than being in that core kind of planning group.
Great. What a great group to have on campus. Yeah, to be really collaborating with that. So great. Any other questions? That was an outstanding one. Great. Well, why don't we look a little bit at the discussion reflection question?
Sure. Maybe let's start with the one at the top. It's kind of a general one. We'd love to hear, how does your individual office or the department that you work in account for the unique needs of international students and supporting that resiliency that we talked about?
Yeah. So just see if you have any thoughts on that. You're welcome to type into the chat box. Oh, we're getting some response here. This is wonderful. Someone saying we have our contract translated into our top 5 languages. That's absolutely fantastic.
That's actually one of our questions is about translating. So that is great to know that people out there are doing that.
Was that institutionally supported for whomever typed that in, or was that something that your department kind of went rogue on?
Okay. Oregon State said it took a lot of work. So we would love to hear about more. I think that might be Catherine. So we can reach out. I know that that's really a problem, as well as with students who get in trouble, quote unquote, and then didn't understand why, or drop dates or payment dates. That can be very confusing and add a layer of stress to their whole experience.
Certainly procedures in general can be one of the most stressful, and certainly for international students coming in, as Sue-Ann was talking about, we saw that a lot in the research, but we also see it with when our students go to study abroad. Really, anytime you're in a new environment, procedures can be one of the all-time most stressful things, because you're already dealing with a lot of procedures and institutional stuff for your visa, and so then kind of adding in more procedures. So that's really amazing that it's just available in the language, and it can really cut through a lot of miscommunication.
Yeah, and they have an added comment here. They needed to have general counsel look at it, of course, and to have much of the legal language looked at so it doesn't just translate word for word. And that's usually the issue, yeah. Okay. Any other comments? Great discussion.
Should we throw out another?
Sure, let's throw out another question.
So another question that I think, so we're going to jump to, which one do we want to jump to? Maybe under community development, the first question there. So in what ways can you encourage domestic and international student interaction? I know that especially working in the residence halls with roommate conflicts like Mariam was talking about, this can be a very challenging piece to get our students to want to interact with each other and be open-minded. And, we talked about how when domestic students are open-minded, they're much more likely to have positive experiences with international students and vice versa. And so what are ways that you've encouraged some of that on your own campuses?
Let's see if there's any comments. Is there anything you all have been doing or seen doing in the halls that has worked really well, or you're thinking about really going into for next year or years past? Or
well, I think thinking about the information about leadership and the kind of goal-oriented tasks, and especially thinking about even when it's not explicitly related to cultural issues in any way, but it's a mutual goal. In my hall council, we break the students into programming groups, and there's groups of usually about 5 to 7 students that are working on a specific program, and they have a lot of autonomy within their group. And so we try to be intentional when we're kind of letting them pick their groups, but also, I think you would have a lot to bring to this group, trying to really make sure that there is that intergroup interaction, and that, for example, we're going to have a cultural program last quarter, and since we do have a very large group of Indian students in our whole council, as I explained, they all wanted to be in the cultural group, and they all wanted to do an Indian student night, which is fantastic, and definitely, they wanted to share their culture with the rest of the residence hall. And so we discussed it with them, and we figured out a way that we would have an Indian student night, and some of them would work on it, and everybody would be kind of involved at the program, but then figuring out what some of the other interests of some of the other students were, some of the other international students in the group, and the domestic students figure out how we could kind of break that up a little bit. And so students were collaborating with students from other backgrounds, and that was really successful. They had a really fun time, and some of them actually, I think, enjoyed the opportunity to work on something that they originally would never have thought of, and they, got the chance to kind of, like we talked about, come up from the side to some of those aspects of intercultural communication.
And again, I work in the Mercer Core departments right now, and so the building that I oversee has about 400 students and is about 40% probably international students. And so inherently, so I guess some context, the way that my building is set up, we have mostly 8 people living in each apartment. So 4 bedrooms, each doubled up, and then 2 bathrooms and a kitchen. And so with 40% of the building being international students, there is a very high chance that at least one person in each apartment is international, and so mostly more than one, obviously. And so simply because we have multiple international students living in each apartment with domestic students, they're able to learn from each other. This year in general, it seems like there has been some more learning, and I think part of that is training that we did with RAs. During RA training, we had the International Student Success Committee come in and do a training with them, and so to kind of help them think about how do they get all their students from the start of the year to want to engage with each other. We, as part of our community development model, have apartment meetings that the RAs facilitate at the start of each quarter to do an icebreaker and kind of do some building connections, but also to talk about things, some of those logistical pieces like cleaning your kitchen and cleaning your bathroom and taking out the trash. And so by having a conversation with all 8 people, some of whom are international, some of whom are domestic, they're able to at least talk through some of those pieces. And so they are doing some of that interacting. And again, maybe they're not best friends in their apartment, but they are still living together and interacting with each other. And so I think that has been helpful with giving the international students some more connection to our domestic students.
A piece that can be really important, and depending on your role, you may or may not have a lot of control over this piece, but winter break housing on your campus can play a very large role in where your students end up in the assignment process. And I know Mariam touched on the fact that the research shows that if they are living with and engaging with domestic students, that's a more enriching experience. They're more likely to be successful. And there are going to be facilities realities for each of your institutions to face. So if you are going in and operating at basically 100% capacity going to winter break, you may not have the flexibility then to move folks from any hall to the designated winter break housing hall because those rooms are already occupied. But if you know that you have some overflow space in each facility during that end of autumn quarter, that may be something for your institution to think about. Can you make sure that your international students are able to be spread across any community that they might be interested in, and then they're living together during winter break housing? Because when you're not able to do that, you can end up unintentionally kind of siloing folks if there's a high need for winter break housing. It's certainly something that we experienced here at the UW, where only our apartment facilities were able to be open during winter break based on staffing and facilities concerns and capacity, and we made a move to open one of our traditional residential facilities for winter break as well to help give those students other options and kind of spread folks out a bit more.
Great. Let's go. I'm not getting any questions from the listeners and the students at home, but we'll do one more discussion question.
How can we prepare our domestic students, speaking kind of specifically about domestic students, how can we prepare them for cross-cultural interactions, whether that's in the residence halls or, future in their future careers, knowing that it is pretty much impossible to have a career these days in 2015 in which you will not interact with somebody who has a background different than yourself?
It's a very important skill. I don't know of any companies, even in the private sector, that aren't asking those questions. They're very, very important. Give me great examples of what you're seeing, or?
One of our colleagues suggested framing it as a skill, that we see it as a skill, but for our students it might feel like, and they, still being careful to honor the fact that maybe this is not exactly what they had in mind when they were getting ready for college and thinking of what their roommate experience would be like, but framing it as, yes, this is different than maybe what you were thinking of, but it's an opportunity, and then in some ways this is what college is all about. It's about having these new experiences, and this is indeed a new experience. And then adding that resume piece, because we know that sometimes our students are very responsive to that in many different ways, and the idea that, this you're building a skill that might make you stand out in an interview, or it might make you the most successful one on your team because you already have experience dealing with people who have very different perspectives than what you have.
I think framing the expectations for folks is important as well, and that starts, as collaborative as you can be with your admissions partners, with orientation. If folks are continuing to hear the message that this is not only an expectation, but it's a really valuable skill that they're learning, that can be really helpful, whereas if they're hearing all through a recruitment process and all through your own housing tours that they're going to get a different experience, that any sort of problems that might come up will be easily mitigated, which we know is not always the case, that can be even more jarring than when they run into cultural concerns with their roommate or their apartment mate. So making sure that that messaging is heard early and often so that they're expecting that, yeah, we're probably going to disagree about some things. Yes, there are going to be some cultural differences, and here are the steps that I'm supposed to take at XYZ institution.
And for our living learning or STEAM communities at different institutions, especially if they're academically focused and have a connection to possibly a private company or organization, I think there's a lot of tie-in possibly in those relationships to frame different questions that they could be getting or help companies articulate that. I know from my connections with Boeing, that's a huge part of their interview process, and folks know coming into that. And so I think students, they focus just on the technical skills they're learning or the academics and really trying to bring it in perhaps to career fairs or different programming that we're doing there. So they're seeing it throughout what we're doing as just a part of that. Right. Well, we have had such a great time this morning. Thank you so much, Sue and Mariam, for taking the time to present to the Northwest Oklahoma region and putting together all this great research and contributing to this body of knowledge. And Mariam's going to add something.
And on that topic, if you flip the page in the handout that you got, we had some case studies that we didn't really have the time to delve into, but we wanted to present them in case you wanted. Maybe you were inspired and you wanted to bring this back to your colleagues. It could be a launching point for a discussion. And then all of our references, there are a lot, and so we highlighted and made in color the ones that we thought would be especially helpful if you have limited time, which we know is 100% of all of us. And the purple items are books, so they might be a little bit harder to find. One, number 6, is really, it's short, it's practical, it has a lot of really great information for practitioners. It is also brand new. And then the gold items are available for free online. So we hope that if you were interested by this and you want to dig in a little bit more, you'll maybe take some time to look at some of those.
Great. I would also just add that while there is not a ton of international student research right now, there is definitely an increasing amount. And even yesterday, when we were presenting to our colleagues, in the morning before our presentation, I brought Mariam this book that I found with a chapter on international students. And so it's not included in our references because we didn't have time to read it yet, but like increasingly we are finding more and more things. And we know that because international students are a growing population on our college campuses, people are recognizing the need to be doing more research. And so I would say keep your eye out on future things as well, because I'm sure there'll be more coming out.
So thank you so much for joining us for the First Friday webinars. We want to remind you again that on the Northwest Akuho website, under First Friday webinars, we do record every single webinar. And so if you're thinking, wow, I would love to share this with other folks on my campus or with another office, or, oh, I'd love to send this link to one of my colleagues who's really working on this, send the link, and it'll be up and kind of by Monday. And it's a great opportunity. You can pause, start, and stop to really share this information, this great experience that we had. So First Friday webinars are put together by the Professional Development Committee of Northwest Akuho, and we're putting together a great year for you. Please join us on May 1st for the next webinar, and we will have that topic out very soon. And I'm going to pass over to Michelle for any Northwest Akuho news.
Great, thank you, Kate. I just want to put, first a quick thank you again to Mariam and Sue Ann for being willing to share this wonderful presentation. I want to put a quick plug in again for our committees. So some of you were able to join us at the annual conference and may have signed up then, but our committees are only as strong as our membership, and our committees exist to serve our membership. So if you are interested in more involvement with the First Friday webinars, if getting engaged with folks throughout the region in mentorship or in coming up with great support networks for our members is of interest to you, or if you're really into communication, you're on Twitter on the back channel, you love Facebook, you like to blog in your spare time, we have great committee roles for you. So I would encourage you to check those out under the committees tab on the Northwest Akuho website.
Thank you so much again, and please have a wonderful Friday, and we look forward to seeing you next month.